right, good morning, everybody. We're letting everybody in from the waiting room, so let's give that just a couple of seconds for everybody to get in. Good morning. My name is Eric Tonsul. I'm one of the shareholders at Roberts Markel Weinberg Butler Haley. Thank you for joining me today. Today we're going to talk about cybersecurity and PII. Also, at the end of the webinar today, Kyle will be emailing everybody a copy of the slide deck, so that way you guys will have that for future reference. And this is going to be a quick one. I anticipate maybe about 30 minutes or so on this particular webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat, and I will address those questions at the end of the seminar. Very quickly, today's presentation is based on the law as it exists today, May 21st, 2024. This is not intended to be legal advice. This is for educational purposes only. If you have any specific questions with respect to your management company or your association, please direct those questions to your legal counsel. All right, next slide, please, Kyle. So today's agenda, we're going to be talking about the most common cyber attacks, cyber risks, best practices, and what is cybersecurity and the law as it relates to cybersecurity. Next slide, please, Kyle. So you're going to hear this term a lot, PII, today. PII stands for Personal Identifiable Information. It includes your name, address, email, telephone number, date of birth, things of that nature. We're going to get more specific with that as to what the law, the definition of PII as it is referred to in Texas law. But just if you hear me say PII, I'm referring to personally identifiable information. Next slide, Kyle. So for management companies, there's no federal law that requires companies to implement any kind of cyber protection. It's kind of Wild West as far as that goes. So it's up to you management companies and associations as to whether or not you guys want to implement any kind of security protocols for cybersecurity. Cybersecurity programs may be less developed and sophisticated than other industries, quite frankly. In smaller companies without cybersecurity systems and a significant amount of PII are perfect targets for cyber criminals. If you don't have any safeguards in place, that and I'll get into this down the road, but as a management company, you have a lot of PII as it relates to homeowners, their information, their PII for the homeowners, information with respect to their any debts that are owed to the association or delinquent assessments, that kind of thing. So you got a lot of PII as it relates for cybersecurity issues. And then operating without training. Strongly encourage you management companies, representatives from management companies that are on this webinar. If you're not already doing it, go through some training, implement training for your staff. So that they have an idea what to look out for. In fact, here at Roberts Markel, we have to do cybersecurity training periodically to make sure, because we just like a management company, we have a lot of PII for homeowners, and so it's of most importance that we make sure that we do whatever we can to safeguard that information. Next slide, please, Kyle. So for management companies, one of the biggest problems you may have is when you allow your staff members to bring their own devices to work, meaning laptops and that kind of thing, and then from that device having access to your system, again, where all the PII resides. So with a personal device, there's uncontrolled access to the network. The laptop in this case may not have appropriate virus or malware protection. And you have company files on personal devices, which is never a good thing. Somebody brings their laptop into work and they use it, and then they, leave their laptop in the back of their car, and their laptop gets stolen. Well, now you got some PII out there that may be used, and we'll talk. There's certainly penalties, state penalties for data breaches, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But so that's why it's very important to really implement safeguards to prevent stuff like that from happening. Next slide, Kyle. So we have social engineering for cyber attacks and risks from these, people that are, we'll just call them bad people, that engineer these attacks. They use known factors to exploit a victim. They typically are presented as a communication from an authority figure. An example is an email disguised as coming from a supervisor asking for money gift cards to be sent to an account or location. That might sound kind of funny or out there, but it's actually happened here at our firm where one of our, I forget who it was, but they received an email, or allegedly received an email from Rick Butler, who's the butler in Roberts Markel Weinberg Butler Haley, asking him to go buy like 100 Visa gift cards and send them to an address. And the employee was like, that's kind of weird that Rick is emailing me. I never hear from Rick. And it was a newer employee, so they didn't even really know who Rick was. It was kind of funny. But anyway, the point being is, thankfully in that situation, the employee went to their supervisor and said, "Hey, Rick Butler emailed me about these gift cards." And the supervisor said, "No, that's not Rick. That's a scam." So in any event, it does occur, it does happen, and you guys need to be mindful and vigilant of the emails that you open, or don't open, I should say. Make sure you're not the target or the victim of a cyber scam. Next slide, please, Kyle. So spam, we all know what spam email is. It's an email you get that's sent to a large number of addresses, and a lot of times they're asking the user to click a link or download a program or something along those lines, and that can ultimately lead to providing that person who sent the email access to your system, which is never a good thing. So for examples, ads, chain letters, spoofing, hoaxes, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please, Kyle. So phishing is that's a PH, not an FISH. I'm sure most of you are fully aware what a phishing email is, and it's a specific type of scam where the email is, pretending to be coming from a reputable company, a friend, a coworker. It's very important that if you guys get an email that looks fishy, no pun intended, that you really scrutinize the email. For example, that the email address could be something weird that doesn't make sense. Like I don't know if you guys can see the picture in here. This says public library at notice-compliance.gov. That in and of itself is kind of funky. So that's question number one. Also, there's oftentimes a lot of misspelled words in a phishing email. Best advice here is, if you're not sure, don't open it. As far as clicking any links within the email itself. I'm sure a lot of you guys use Outlook. Outlook actually has a phishing button on the top ribbon that if you think of an email as potentially phishing, you can click that phishing and report it. But again, at the end of the day, and when you get an email in Outlook, I'm sure most of you have this function where you have the reading pane. So you're not actually opening the email, but you can see the content of the email. So it's best not to open those emails that come in if you think they are phishing or spam, scam, whatever. So make sure that again, just be vigilant. And when in doubt, don't open it, because all it takes is one click on a link or something of that nature, and that could be a nightmare. Next slide, please, Kyle. Let's get down to brass tacks here. The average cost for a data breach is $150 per record. So consider how many individuals' records a management company has in your database for all of the owners' information that you have. So the average cost is $150 per record. You do the math on that. That could potentially bankrupt a management company or an association if you do have a data breach. That's why this topic is so important. Just so you guys are aware of what the potential consequences are in the event you're the victim of a data breach. Next slide, please. So the most common cyber attacks are malware, malicious software. Malware is basically you click a link and it basically installs a program on your computer, and it provides the I'll call them the hacker access to your computer and your system, and the ability, again, depending upon the malware that they're using, but the ability to obtain information from your system. You also have a denial of service attacks, which is a targeted attack that floods the network with false requests. You have phishing, which we've already talked about. You have spoofing, which is when an email disguises the sender as a known or trusted source. Again, they're just putting on a mask, basically. And then identity-based attacks, which are 80% of all breaches, use compromised identities. If you guys, for example, are on Facebook, a lot of times you might get a friend request or something along those lines from somebody that you know, or they send you a message on social media and say, hey, click this link, check it out. And it turns out that their profile has been hacked, and this request is just perpetuating the scam. So again, also, I'm not talking about social media right now, but as far as your systems go, as your emails and that kind of thing, that can happen. So again, you got to be very mindful of what you're opening or not opening. Next slide, Kyle. So let's talk law now. So Section 521.002 of the Business and Commerce Code, the Texas Business and Commerce Code, is what sets forth the law for cybersecurity. So again, the PII that I mentioned earlier, is name, social security number, date of birth, government issue identification, and then you guys can read the rest. But there's a lot of, not just the small list I referenced earlier, but it goes into a whole lot of information as to what exactly constitutes PII. And telecommunication access device as defined by 3251 of the Penal Code. Next slide, Kyle. And again, we're still talking about PII. It's not just like a person's name. It could be individual's first name or first initial and the last name in combination with any one or more of the following items, if the name and the items are not encrypted. So social security number, driver's license number, account number, credit card numbers, etc. And then information that identifies an individual and relates to the physical or mental health or condition of the individual, the provision of health care to the individual, or the payment for the provision of health care to the individual. So this is all PII. This is all information that if there's a data breach and includes this PII, then there's potential penalties, that $150 average per record that I mentioned earlier. We're going to get into other penalties here in just a minute, but this is the type of information that we're trying to safeguard and not have that data be breached by a hacker. Next slide, Kyle. So 521.053, these are the notice requirements in the event of a data breach pursuant to the Business and Commerce Code. So if a person whose sensitive personal information was acquired no later than 60 days after the breach, you have to give them notice, no later than 60 days after the breach. And the notice is defined as written notice to the last known address, electronic notice like an email, or notices provided by subsection F, which we're going to reference here in just a minute. The notice can be delayed at the request of a law enforcement agency if there's like an ongoing investigation and the cops specifically tell you not to notify the victims of the data breach. Next slide, Kyle. So if the breach affects more than 250 residents, the AG must be notified no later than 60 days after the breach. The notice must include a detailed description of the nature and circumstances of the breach or the use of sensitive PII acquired as a result of the breach, the number of residents of the state affected by the breach at the time of notification, the number of affected residents that have been sent a disclosure of the breach by mail or other direct method of communication at the time of the notification, the measures taken by the person regarding the breach, any measures the person intends to take regarding the breach after the notification under the subsection, and finally, information regarding whether law enforcement is engaged in investigating the breach. So again, this is all necessary if the breach affects more than 250 residents. So if you have a management company, for example, you're most likely, if you have a data breach, there's a very high likelihood that the breach is going to affect more than 250. So again, you have to contact the Texas AG and you have to, within 60 days, and provide all this information on the slide. Next slide, Kyle. So the civil penalties for violation of Chapter 521, which is what we just discussed, ranges from $2,000 to $50,000 for each violation. So it's a very steep monetary penalty if you do not comply with Chapter 521 of the Business and Commerce Code. Civil penalties for violating the notice requirements, not more than $100 for each individual to whom notification is due for each consecutive day failure to take reasonable action. And penalties are not to exceed $250,000 after a single breach. But again, penalties are very high, kind of scary, which is all the more reason why, doing your best to employ or utilize cybersecurity in your place of business, or even if you're an association, you're self-managed. You still have PII as it relates to your residents. So again, very important that you guys take these steps to make sure that you do whatever you can to avoid a potential breach. Next slide, please, Kyle. So long-term ramifications from a cyber attack. Give me 1 second here, guys. Sorry. First of all, loss of trust from your community. If you are breached, a lot of people may not have a lot of faith in your cybersecurity, so that's a problem. Potential lawsuit against the association and or the management company, depending upon the severity of the breach and the consequences of the information that's obtained illegally by these hackers. It could lead to a large damage amount in the case of a ruling against the association of the management company. Could increase your attorney's fees. And then also it may increase if you have become a victim of a cyber attack. It could increase your cyber insurance and your D&O premiums, and you maybe even lose your cyber insurance coverage depending upon the severity of the attack. So there's a lot of negative ramifications that can occur as a result of a breach. Next slide, please, Kyle. So best practices for cybersecurity: passwords, and don't do like 11111. Use something that's fairly, difficult to figure out or guess. It's always good to use like the first letter, use a capital letter, and then at the end use a special character of some sort. Usually, say make it at least 8 characters long, whatever. But and admittedly, I'm in my own personal life, I'm kind of guilty of this. I have the same password for a lot of my accounts. Not a good idea. So the speaker here should take his own advice. But make sure you guys use fairly strong passwords. You could use a password manager like Bitwarden, for example. And again, like I said, it's best practice to have a unique password for each different type of account. Use two-factor authentication. If you're familiar with that, we use that here at the firm for accessing our system, and passphrases. Next slide, please, Kyle. So the benefit of having company-owned devices is that you can limit website access. You can have your IT administrator, limit what websites are available to the users. You can avoid, personal use. Here we have company issued laptops, and they're to be used for work only. I don't do any personal work or any personal use of my company computer for personal use. You can control program downloads. You can have strong virus and malware software, and then you can have cybersecurity monitoring service. So that's reason why it's not. Of course, on the front end, it's going to cost potentially the company the upfront cost for purchasing this hardware for use by your employees. However, that cost is probably going to pale in comparison to the cost as if you're hit with a major data breach, and all those penalties, those financial penalties we talked about earlier, are most likely going to be way higher than any amount you guys spend on hardware for your employees. Next slide, please, Kyle. So best practices for cybersecurity, cyber training for employees. Like I mentioned earlier, we do that here at Roberts Markel. It's helpful because I'm a pretty tech savvy guy, but even that cybersecurity training is helpful because there may be some new things that come out that I'm unaware of. So highly encourage, especially management companies, to have cyber training for your employees. It highlights the cybersecurity risks, learn how to recognize threats, and reinforce best practices. And last slide is the conclusory slide. Ensure you have specific IT policies and procedures and they're followed closely. There's no sense in having these policies and procedures if they're not going to be followed. The long-term investment in cybersecurity is financially beneficial in the event of a breach, which is what I just mentioned earlier. Trust the experts. Require cybersecurity training for all your employees. Again, that's a huge one. I strongly recommend that. There's two types of companies: those who've been attacked and those who, I shouldn't say who will, but most likely will is probably a better phrase there. And lastly, buying cyber insurance, something that if you don't have, I strongly recommend that you contact your insurance broker to see, what they offer and the cost and all that kind of good stuff, and then you make a decision at that time, as from a management company standpoint, as to whether that makes sense. But again, if it's reasonably affordable, I would strongly recommend that you obtain cyber insurance coverage. All right, that is the end of the presentation. I'm going to go to the chat and see what questions we have. And let me see here. First question is, should a management company give the property owner the option to hide their information, names, phone numbers, email, property address from other property owners? Is that information then considered PII or confidential? Again, once you have that information at the management company, that's PII, as it's defined in the statute. So even if it's hidden from other property owners, you still have the access to it as a management company. So that is not going to negate any potential. If there's a data breach, they're going to get it from your system most likely. Again, it depends on where the breach occurs, but if it occurs through the management company software, either through phishing or whatever, however they gain access, that's the PII, and that's going to, and then the data breach, they have to go through all those notices that I mentioned earlier, and potentially, depending upon the nature and the circumstances, there may be some potential liability. Would it be considered a breach if an employee downloaded all the resident information, name, address, phone numbers, SSN, and then emailed that info to themselves at the business email they use for another company? Yeah, I mean, that's the management company is going, your employees are, a branch of your company. They're working, if they're working for ABC Management Company, and they do something that sends the PII that you've collected as a result of being a management company, and they distribute it in how or whether they email to themselves, or let's just go crazy, they post all the information on their Facebook page just for the hell of it. That's a potential breach, and so you got to be very careful with what you have with that PII that you have. Next question: is a board member's duty of confidential sufficient to the extent that a board does not need a formally defined confidentiality policy? It depends. There's not anything in the property code as relates to board member confidentiality. Typically, for our clients, we have a code of conduct that we prepare for our boards upon request, and that will say the types of information that board members are not supposed to divulge without a majority board approval. For example, topics discussed during executive session of a board meeting. Board members should not be discussing that with a non-board member or non-manager or the legal counsel. But yeah, that happens sometimes. So there's nothing in place that really, from a statutory standpoint, that requires a board member to keep that type of information confidential. So if you have concerns about that, I suggest that you contact your legal counsel about adopting a code of conduct. Usually I draft them for board members, officers, and committee members, and it says what they should or shouldn't do with respect to a myriad of different things, but confidential information is one of those things. Any tips for board members using personal devices to access HOA information maintained by the management company? Also, should HOAs adopt a tech policy, cyber policy? The cyber policy, I'm not aware. Well, let me back up. I personally have not drafted a cybersecurity policy for an association. With respect to board members using personal devices to access HOA information, that's, you have to do that. But again, in that case, strongly recommend that you have good virus protection software, malware protection software, and then you employ the tips and tricks that I mentioned earlier as far as emails and that kind of thing that are suspicious, or that just they don't pass a smell test, the sniff test. Also be very careful with your laptops. Like I said, we've had individuals here at our firm who've had laptops stolen out of their vehicles. The good news is with us and the way we're set up, if that happens, our IT administrator can shut down that laptop and they can't gain whoever stole it can't gain access to our system. Now, as a personal individual, I don't have that on my personal laptop at home. So if my personal laptop got stolen, um, people would be able to access. Now, I don't do any work on my personal laptop. I only use my work laptop. So that's a safeguard there. But again, if nothing else, make sure you have good, again, virus software, um, malware software, and that you use best practices as far as things that you open or don't open or download to avoid having that information be compromised. Um, would Julie's mentioned breach trigger the notification requirements? What was Julie's breach? Julie, if an employee download, yes, I mean that's a data breach. So again, the one about notifying the Texas AG, that's if more than 250 residents have been that it exceeded 250 or above. So if it's below, you still have to notify. You don't have to notify the AG, but you have to notify the victim or the people whose information was compromised. So that is all the questions we got. In that case, who is responsible for notifying is from Julie. If it was a management company's information that where the information was obtained, or like the employee of the management company should be the one to make the notification. Um, so that's the answer to that. Any other questions? I'll wait here a couple of seconds, see if anything else comes in. It does not look like it. All right. I'm just going to go ahead and cut it there. So again, I appreciate you guys taking the time to join me this morning. Hopefully this information was helpful. Again, Kyle will be sending everybody a copy of the slide deck. So you guys will have this information for your future reference. A lot of thank yous in the chat. Thank you. I appreciate y'all taking the time out to listen to me. And so anyway, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.